I ain't much for talking, friend, but I'll tell it plain as a fence post. A silent cowboy moved into a boarded house no one would buy, and his dog wouldn't cross the threshold. That cowboy was me. The dog was Ranger, a big-shouldered German shepherd with eyes like a storm looking for a place to land. Folks in Dry Willow said the place on Haint Ridge drank men whole and spit back their spurs. I didn't plan to be swallowed. I only planned to keep the rain off my hat and sleep where the wind couldn't count my bones. It was a late gold afternoon when I first rode up. Boards crisscrossed the windows like a jail made for light. Someone had dabbed pitch along the seams so thick it looked wet, though the day was dry and the sky clean. The front door bowed in the middle and held a plank nailed across like a scared man's arms. Weeds pushed through the steps, seed heads rattling like the tail of a little bell. Ranger hopped down and sniffed slow, one paw on the stoop, shoulders tight, breath held. Then he sat back, hard, as if the shadow spilling from that doorway was more than shade. Easy, I told him, though my own voice sounded like boots on a church floor. I pried the plank, shouldered the door, and she went open with a sigh that felt too human. Dust rose like a soft curse. Ranger planted himself at the lip, and that's where he stayed. Right at the threshold, head low, ears up, chest like a fieldstone. I'd seen him barrel through gunsmoke and thunder, but he would not cross that line. The way his claws kissed the sill told me everything I needed. Something in there had a smell he didn't respect. You learn to trust a dog when the world won't trust you back. I left my bedroll just inside, like a promise I didn't want to keep, and took a slow drift through the front room. The house was fine-boned once, built by hands that loved corners. Now it was all size and splinters. A parlor with a dead piano, a stair like a spine, wallpaper peeled in curls that looked like tongues trying to speak. In the back, a kitchen held its breath. A single plate hung on a nail. The window over the sink was dimmed by slats nailed outside, the heads shiny and new, as if someone had boarded her up last night just to make sure the day couldn't tell her any secrets. I walked back to the door and looked at Ranger. "You comin'?" Ranger huffed, glanced sideways and fixed on the seam where floor met sill. He slid his nose along it and snorted as though the wood was singing low. Then he sat. That was his final. So I set a lantern on the floor beside him, his side, and rolled up my sleeves. I wasn't after ghosts. I was after quiet. A ranch job had soured on me, and work was scarce enough some men queued to dig their own pride a grave. The bank was letting this house go for a whisper and a handshake, because nobody in Dry Willow wanted to be the one to stand under its roof when the world bent wrong. I'd slept in worse. I'd slept where coyotes stitched the dark with needles of noise. A roof is a roof, I told myself, even if it groans when you touch it. I walked the hall again, letting my palm read the walls the way a blind man reads a Bible. There were places where the wood throbbed a little under the hand, like a drum skin too tight. In the dining room, a breath of air came from nowhere and went nowhere, fluttering a length of torn curtain in a room with no open door. I don't spook easy, but I ain't a fool. I chalked a line on the floor where the draft seemed strongest. The chalk dust swirled and drew itself toward a hairline crack between two baseboards, then sank like it fell through. When the sun slipped and the kitchen windows turned to coins, I heard a carriage, not with my ears but with my bones. It was a hollow rolling sound inside the walls, as if someone had taught the house to carry wheels. I set my hat brim with 2 fingers and smiled a nothing smile. "All right," I said to the empty place. "You can talk, but you talk plain." The night shook out its black coat and the wind found the ridge. Out on the porch, I rolled a cigarette and met Evelyn Hart for the first time. She came up the path set straight and calm, a white dress taking the dusk like a held candle. She had banker's eyes, clear, careful, measuring, but there was warmth in her voice when she said my name. "Mr. Maddox, they said you took the deed. I took the chance of it," I said. She looked past me at the door, at Ranger hunched like a sentry who'd taken an oath. "Is it true?" she asked, her mouth curving with nerves she wouldn't ever confess. About the voices, about the boards nailing themselves every evening. I tipped my chin. It's true that stories grow in dry soil, they drink whatever's left. She smiled then, a neat surprise thing that showed she'd hoped for that answer, and also hoped I was wrong. Evelyn wasn't the first pretty woman I'd seen, but she was the kind that made the air rearrange. In the last of the light, the dress and her skin were both pale, and her hair was pinned so tight it shone like a crow's back. The boarded house behind me and that white dress in front made a picture a painter would hang his hopes on. Ruin and grace, married by a threshold a dog wouldn't cross. She told me the bank would be out tomorrow with papers, that I should know there were liens and rumors, and a sheriff who preferred the rumors because they were easier to hold. She told me Pike, the blacksmith, claimed the house belonged to bad ground that never gave a man a fair trade, and she mentioned in a voice that carried a velvet edge that Lila Finch had been through. Lila of the saloon lark, who wore sorrow like perfume and hate like a garter. She said the house doesn't like company, Evelyn added, and her smile this time was thin as a blade. But I suppose Lila and company are one and the same. I told Evelyn I didn't mind a house with opinions. We shook hands, and her grip was steady as a fence post in spring mud. She left with a nod to Ranger, who thumped his tail once but kept his oath to the line. When she was a ridge away, the breeze died like a tune forgotten, and the boards on the windows settled with a sound like teeth deciding. I turned in, or tried. The parlor held less sleep than a cold stove. Every time my eyes met the rafters, the house met them back. Somewhere upstairs, a picture frame tapped the wall in a slow beat, like a doctor taking a pulse. I took to walking. In the hall, I found a length of cord run through a drilled hole and down into the cellar, taut as a fiddle string. It was old, but not old enough. I squatted, listened. The cord sang in a key so low it wasn't a sound at all. I eased a finger to it. The hum climbed into my bones. Ranger, out on the sill, let out one sound only, short, warning, the way he told me a rattler was near even when the grass was lying to my eyes. Noted, I said. I followed the cord. The cellar was a mouth. Dirt floor, stacked stone, crossbeams like ribs. My lantern halo found another cord and another, all strung through small holes bored into the floor joists, each leading to a wall where someone had cut a notch and driven in a peg. No blood, no witch marks, no candles. Just cords, pegs, and a thing like a bellows half disassembled. Leather cracked but oiled, as if a man meant it to breathe again. The whole place felt like a throat waiting for air. I reached for the bellows handle and stopped, sensing how much the house wanted me to finish what some other man had started. Not tonight, I told it. You can sing for me when I know the tune. Back upstairs, I set my bedroll in the front room again, on the cleanest patch I'd found with my knife edge. The moon was a coin behind the boards, light slotted into ladders that climbed the far wall. I took off my boots and set them toes toward the door, a habit for luck. Ranger's shadow fell across the threshold, and every time I drifted, the shadow moved like a tide. Around midnight, the house began a slow murmur, air moving in from someplace high, rolling down the stair and along the wainscot, murmuring names I did not know. Maybe I dreamed it. Maybe someone wanted me to think I did. When the sound found my name, Bill, soft as felt, I sat straight up and laughed once without humor. You don't know me that well, I said to the dark. You're using borrowed lips. Toward dawn, I finally slept. I dreamed I was standing on the porch and the whole house was breathing through that single line Ranger wouldn't cross. Each breath pulled in night and pushed out morning, and somewhere beneath my feet the cords thrummed like a hive. When I woke, the light was clean and early, and the boards on the east windows wore new nail heads that had not been there before. I know wood. I know iron. Those heads were fresh and proud as buttons on a parade coat. I stepped out to the porch. Ranger rose and shook himself as if he'd worn the night like a wet blanket. He touched my knee with his nose, then put that same nose to the threshold seam and worked it like a riddle. He sneezed, backed up one step, and glanced down the path to where the road curled away toward the old hotel by the highway. The one folks said had been boarded twice as long and twice as bad. He flicked his ears at me and looked again, which is Ranger 4. There's a start over yonder. I hear you, I said. I poured him water, drank from the same tin, and we watched the sun pry the valley's eyes open. Dry willow looked almost kind from that porch. Dust soft as flour. Cottonwoods shaking their green hands. The boarded house behind me felt lighter in the day, but only the way a heavy man feels lighter when he stands on someone else's foot. A rider came by just before noon. A man with a bandana pale from too much sun and a mustache shaped like a question nobody wanted to answer. He tipped his hat. "You sleep?" Enough to know I was awake. He chuckled. "Name's Pike. You'll be wanting iron sooner or later. All these old places do." His eyes went past me into the gloom. "You hear it?" "I heard something. House sings," he said, spitting into the dust with a kind of ceremony. "Bad ground underneath. Old storm cave. Air gets trapped and runs around like a rabbit, whining and knocking boards loose. Best to let it be. Storm caves don't oil bellows," I said. Pike's eyes sharpened, then slipped back to friendly. He shrugged. "You're the owner," he said. "Owner can learn his lessons the way he likes." He told me Lila Finch would be by with a pie that wasn't about pie, and that Evelyn Hart had the sort of face that makes a man overpromise. He told me the house had seen men trying to be brave and men trying to be clever, and it always made both kinds tired. When he left, the day turned still as a marsh. I thought about the cords in the cellar and the bellows waiting like a lung, about the new nails shining like little lies, about Ranger's refusal to cross one sliver of wood, and his keen insistence I looked down the road. I thought about Evelyn's white dress in the bluing dusk, and the way the boards had sounded like teeth when she left. I rolled my sleeves again, took my hammer, and pulled one board off the kitchen window to let the morning own its share of that room. As the board came free, I heard it clear. A long, low note like a train calling to a track it hadn't met yet. It rose through the wall and ran under my hand. The cord in the floor hummed. Somewhere far off, maybe at the old hotel, someone cranked a handle and smiled. Ranger barked once, sharp, pleased, to say he'd heard it too. He pawed the edge of the sill and then, very gently, set one paw across, then another. He stood with his forepaws inside and back paws out, balanced on the boundary, eyes hot and bright, ears searching. Then he stepped back again and sat, tail sweeping once like a brush on a signature. "All right," I told him. "No crossing until the house earns it. We'll start with air and ends with names." That's how it began. A silent cowboy moving into a boarded house no one would buy. A dog who wouldn't cross the threshold. A white-dressed banker with a mouth full of hard truths. A blacksmith who knew the taste of smoke. And a saloon queen who wore rumor like a veil. It wasn't ghosts I feared. It was the hands behind the curtain, turning the crank that taught the walls to sing. And if I've got this story right, you'll hear the music the way I did. Out of sight first, then under skin, then right up close where you can't mistake the tune for anything but a human being trying to scare another human being off a place that wasn't for sale. I didn't wait for the bank or for courage to grow in me like weeds. I set to work while the sun still had its say, pulling 2 more boards from the kitchen so daylight could do what daylight does, show hands from shadows. Ranger stayed at the line, nose to the seam, breathing slow like he was drinking the room a sip at a time. Each time a nail squealed loose, he flicked an ear toward the old hotel road and glanced at me as if to say, "It's playing both ends, Bill." I set coffee on the stove with kindling from my saddlebag tin. The stacked wood out back looked kissed by too many wet nights. While I waited for a boil, I walked the parlor tapping baseboards with my knife handle. Some spots tapped hollow and sang back. Others sat quiet as a church after the last hymn. I knelt to the hairline crack I'd chalked and felt a draft like a whisper from a mouth that didn't want to be seen. Evelyn showed with noon, papers tucked under her arm like a folded bird. The white dress had become a cream coat and a hat with a brim fine enough to slice envy. She stopped shy of Ranger's shoulder. "Is he always like that?" "He's always right," I said, pouring coffee into a pewter cup and offering it across the boundary. "You'll sign?" "I'll sign that I'll try," I said. "Long as you note the house is trying back." We moved to the porch because a threshold's a hard place to speak when one of you won't cross it. She smoothed the papers with fingers that had learned patience from ledgers and disappointment from men. The wind carried pitch again, fresh as last hour. "You smell it too," she said. "Not old." "Recent," I said. "A man in a hurry with a brush, making sure the day sticks to what he wants folks to believe." Her eyes cut to the old hotel road. "If I were hiding effort, I'd pick a place already guilty by rumor." Then at me, "They say you're silent, Mr. Maddox. Seems you speak when it counts." "I get charged by the word," I said. She laughed. When she handed me the deed, her wrist brushed my knuckles, light as a bird landing. For a breath I forgot chords and bellows. Then a low moan rolled through the hall, steady as a beam deciding to be old. "I do not like being lied to," she told the room. "Not by men, not by houses. I'll find the liar," I said. "If it's wood, I'll sand it. If it's a man, I'll name him." "I'll be back at dusk," she said. "Pike says the house sings when the light leaves." "Pike likes sayings," I said. She left straight-backed, boots calm. Ranger huffed. "How he tells me my thoughts are showing." "I know," I said. "Work first." I tied a length of twine to the cord that ran through the floor and followed its path to the cellar hole. Down below, cool rose like old breath. I dropped the twine and listened to it hiss against stone. A pulley squeaked, and the house gave a soft answer in its ribs. It wasn't a ghost. It was design, the way a man with half an instrument and a mean heart can make music enough to sell a story. From the pantry came a thump and scrabble. I opened the door ready for sin and found a goat, fat on spilled grain, blinking like I'd interrupted a hymn. Ranger's tail thumped twice. Relief and humor. "You ain't the first spook I've met," I told the goat, shooing him with my hat. He trot-galloped off the porch beard first, leaving a smell strong enough to argue with pitch. The laugh that left me shaved the house's growl. Back in the parlor, dust by the stair held Prince delicate as a songbird. High heels, narrow, toes aiming up. Lila Finch, or any woman who learned to walk like she owned men's decisions. The prince curved around a warped board as if the feet knew where the floor would squeal. I pressed the wood. It gave and sang one note from low in the wall. That note floated, found a chord and made it hum back. Foot to board, board to wall, wall to chord. Conversation headed elsewhere. "Bill." Pike stood by his horse like a man apologizing for bringing company. The company walked a half step ahead. Lila Finch in a dark plum dress that made the dust blush. Hair raven shiny, lips like a promise owed by someone else. She carried a pie on a blue plate you could see yourself in if you wanted to lie. "Darlin'," she said, sugar and knives. "We brought good cheer." She brought pie. Pike coughed. Lila's eyes passed over Ranger and settled on me like a hand that knew where the hurt was. "I hear you took the deed." Bold. Some men tell stories of bravery. Others step into them. Her gaze flicked to the doorway where Ranger sat. "Though even brave men know when to stop." "Ranger stops when he's right," I said. "And you?" She tilted her head. The plum hat threw her face into soft shadow so the whites of her eyes glowed. "Do you stop?" "Not when there's pie." She smiled like she'd been given something to put in a jar. I set a crate for the plate. She kept a hand on it a heartbeat too long, proving the pie was a message with crust. "What's the message?" I asked. "Because naming saves time and dignity. Some places prefer to be empty," Lila said. "We like legends tidy. Busy nights, quiet mornings. If you stay, you might turn tidy into troublesome." "Troublesome for who?" "For men who plan," she said. "For women who plan around those men." A glance at Pike, who studied his boots like they'd learned a secret. "For me," she added, honest enough to make me like her half a second. Pike cleared his throat. "House is loud come sundown. I'll be by with a jug." Jugs make loud seem helpful. You're kind, I said, but I aim to listen clean. Lila's smile cooled. Clean ears hear what dirty ears ignore. I warn you as a neighbor. There are men who don't like their music interrupted. She leaned as if to smell the room at my back. And there are women who don't like men who can't be coaxed inside. Ranger gave one breath of sound. Lila's eyes cut to him, then to the seam he guarded. Some women soften around a good dog. Lila sharpened. She slid a card into a crack in the porch post, slow so I could watch her fingers. If you need help sleeping, she said lightly. The lark keeps long hours. They left. Dust settled like old advice. I stood with pie, pitch, and goat ghosts thinking how Lila said empty like a velvet chair she'd warmed and didn't want shared. I cut a slice and set it on a tin plate at Ranger's feet. He sniffed and looked at me. I slid the plate half over the line. He ate what stayed outdoors and left a perfect crescent on the part that touched the house. Devoted and particular. With the day sliding west, I did what I'd been putting off. Climbed the stairs. Each tread answered with a complaint from its own history. The heel prints curved into a room with a narrow iron bed and a vanity where some other century's woman had considered her face. On the vanity lay a corked bottle with a few drops of clear oil and a rag that smelled like new wagon wheels. I touched the rag. It glistened honest. No dust, no age. Someone had fed these boards oil like a secret. Ear to plaster, I caught a long hollow tone, then another. Two notes calling each other from far fields. I pictured pipes thin as a wrist, joints new soldered bright as a dime, turning my walls into a poor man's organ. I found a closet panel reset crooked by a guilty hand and eased it free. Behind ran a pipe down to the floor and up into the attic, and a hole bored just big enough to feed twine. I threaded a strand and let it fall. The floor answered with a faraway kiss. Ranger barked once below. Someone on the road. I wiped my prints from the vanity and went down quiet. Sheriff Calder stood by the steps, hat in hand, the sort of respect a man shows what he can't see and doesn't want to step in. He had reader's eyes and a way of standing that said he knew which parts of him ached when the weather turned. Miss Hart said you signed, he said. I did. I don't like this house. I like what men do with it less. He worked his jaw. You hear singing? I hear a man with a crank and a plan. Don't kick boards yet, he said. County's got hands in this property that ain't washed. I'd rather catch the man at the crank than find the crank without the man. He glanced at Ranger. Dog won't cross? Not yet. Good dog, he said, kneeling to scratch once along the jaw. Ranger accepted, then returned to watch like he'd thanked him in a language we'd both learned young. I'll circle the ridge at sundown, he said. If the house sings, I'll see who's humming. Evelyn came as the light broke apart, calm and exact. She set her coat on the porch chair and stood with me and Ranger, three figures listening to a house hold its breath. When the sun's last sliver slid under the hills, the note began. Low, round, the kind that makes you think of train tunnels. It rose through the walls and skated along the floorboards. The windows trembled like teeth considering chatter. Her hand found the porch post. Her profile looked carved to teach resolve. No more lies, she said. Let's end this. I followed the note like a creek to its spring. Ranger tracked me from the threshold. Body coiled but legs stone. I put my palm to plaster where the tone felt strongest and felt a faint tick, 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 like a metronome inside a heart. I stepped to the cellar door. The tick grew teeth. I lifted the latch and went down cool. The cords sang. The bellows lay as I'd left it, but now a thin leather hose had been clipped on, oiled new. Someone had been here while I was upstairs measuring ghosts. Someone nimble. Someone who could find quiet boards and heels. Anger flashed like a brand. I let it pass. Clumsy hands lose answers. I followed the hose to a small wooden box I hadn't noticed because it looked like nothing. Inside, a handle turned steady. Not by itself, by a weight looping over a pulley below the dirt. A weight wound earlier and now unspooling with patient malice. I stopped the handle with 2 fingers. The house sighed into quiet. It was a toy I called up, anger cooling into purpose. A sneaky one. I found the reset, wound it once. The house moaned, unwound. It died. A machine to make music without a man present, so a man could be seen elsewhere when the sheriff came looking. I tied the cord in a childish knot and smiled at the thought of soft fingers failing it. On the last step, the dust had been swept gently with a handkerchief. A small, sure footprint ghosted there, the kind of foot that walked a saloon floor and could find a man's knee in a crowd without looking down. I came up slow. The yard held shadow and the sheriff's shape in the cottonwoods. The road held no one, but the air held plumb, faint as a memory. Lila's calling card winked from the porch post like a tiny white tongue. "Evenin'," I told the road. "Enjoy the song." The dark didn't answer. A goat bleated like a man losing a bet. Wind turned, bringing the smell of Pike's hot iron. The note did not return. The house listened to itself and found quiet good for once. Evelyn exhaled the way a woman exhales when a doctor says benign. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like to sleep in a town that doesn't believe in hexes." "Don't thank me yet," I said. "Machines make music. Men make machines. I mean to know the man." Ranger stood, shook his coat, and put both paws on the sill, eyes set on the road east to the old hotel. He didn't cross, he didn't need to. He'd drawn our map enough for one day. We ate pie while the sky relearned its stars. I told Evelyn what lay below. She listened with banker calm and woman fury. "If this is right of way," she said, "there'll be papers to trace, payments wrapped in good intentions." "Tomorrow," I said, "we go readin'." "Tomorrow," she said. She gathered her coat, nodded to Ranger like to a deputy, and started down the path. After 3 steps, she turned. "You can call me Evelyn." "Well then, Evelyn," I said. "You can call me Bill." She smiled just enough to make the moment good without promising more, and walked into Cottonwood dark. Sheriff Calder's shape peeled off the trees, crossed behind her, and tipped his hat like a man who'd seen enough for now. I sat with Ranger until the cricket choir took the stage. The chords rested, the weight waited. I rubbed the fur between his ears where it grows stubborn and thick. "We're getting close," I told him. He sighed and laid his head on the threshold, half in the house's reach, half out in the honest open. That looked as fine a prayer as any church could fashion from wood and light. Before sleep, I walked the porch, counting boards the way a man counts breaths after a ride. Beyond the yard, lightning flickered far off without thunder, like a card sharp flashing silver with no intent to cut. The house held steady. Ranger lifted his head, listened, then let it drop again. The kind of trust a man borrows and tries his best to earn. I woke to a clean light and a quiet house, which told me the downstairs machine still had its cord tied dumb. I brewed coffee thin and split a heel of bread with Ranger. He took his share polite, then went back to his post at the seam with the same old oath in his bones. The line had become a rule between us, a hush you don't break until it's earned. We set for town, me on Shiner and Ranger pacing the dust with that loping grace built to read land like scripture. The bank sat like a bright tooth. Evelyn waited on the steps, cream coat again, hat square, eyes making notes before pens could. "We'll start with filings," she said by way of hello. "Rights of way, timber easements, telegraph filings nobody reads until a fence shows up in their kitchen. I prefer my fences outdoors," I said. Inside, the clerk had the look of a man told to be helpful who hopes to disappoint. Evelyn softened him by using his name twice and letting him tell us how the new index was his own bright idea. Papers came in stacks that smelled of dust, ink, and other folks' plans. We sifted slow. Ranger lay under my chair, chin on paws, ears taking turns at the bank noises. By mid-morning we had a run. Small payments to a W. Hale & Company for temporary access maintenance, which is a phrase you say when you don't want to say what you're doing. Another page showed a donation to Pike's Smithy for community safety improvements, which is how you tip a man for fixing hinges on rumors. A third ledger line, neat as a knife cut, paid the saloon lark for refreshments during civic meetings. That's tidy money. The kind that dries invisible if you don't know which light to tilt it toward. Evelyn's jaw worked. "They're watering a future road," she said, tapping the margins with a fingernail that could have counted coins on the run. "The ridge line behind your house to the old hotel, then down valley to the freight spur. If the house stays empty, so much the better. No one to sue when the wagons chew up their life. Or when the telegraph cuts across their shade," I said. She gave me a quick look that measured whether I was the sort of man who learned new words slow. "Telegraph, yes. And later, the other wires. The kind that carry voices later. The right people are planning to be righter. The rest of us were not told." "Consider me told," I said. We walked 2 doors down to the recorder's office, a room that knew the weight of men's claims. Sheriff Calder met us there, hat off by habit indoors. He listened like a man who wants a clean line to whoever will have to be arrested. "What I can't figure," he said when she finished, "is why they'd bother with music inside your house when they could have just posted a sign that says plague. Because fear travels farther when it's sung," Evelyn said. Calder's mouth twitched. "That's a truth I wish wasn't pretty." He eased a box onto the counter, receipts from Pike's Forge. "Boy's been buying pipe small gauge and bellows straps." He slid a chit out. "From W. Hale and Company." I turned the slip. The address was the old Hotel Road, mile marker 6. Folks called it a hotel because it used to be one. Now it was a skeleton that learned to stand up out of habit. Evelyn's eyes went to me and found me already nodding. Ranger's tail thumped under the counter. 2 beats, start and go. We rode out with noon heat pressing our shirts. The valley squinted. Grasshoppers clacked like coins. Keep Out was painted in tired red. The locked door gave to a crowbar like a lie to proof. Inside, paths were clean where clean had reason. To the desk, to the back hall, to the stair. We followed Ranger to a ballroom turned workroom. Scrap pipe, tins of pitch, a map tacked to the wall with forks for nails. On the map, a red grease pencil line climbed Haint Ridge. Crossed the square of my house, slid toward the spur like it owned the land. The map on the wall wore forked tacks and a red grease line that bragged its route. Crossing Haint Ridge and sliding toward the spur as if destiny was a straight road. We stared at it, and the lie felt almost honest. "Subtle," I said. "Proud," Evelyn corrected. "Men who make machines to frighten are proud of their clever." Inside a crate were weights, lead wrapped in sacking, each tied to a loop of cord. The cord smelled like cellar and new finger oil. Calder knelt, lifted a weight, and grunted. "A man winds this at noon, lets it unspool at dusk. If he's called on the carpet, he can be sitting here drinking coffee while your parlor plays church." A back door groaned. We turned as one. Pike stood in the frame, jaw working like he was chewing a word he didn't like. Behind him, 2 men built like refinery hands. "Bill," Pike said, then to Evelyn. "Miss Hart." He tipped his hat to the sheriff last. "You shouldn't be here." "That's helpful," Calder said, dry as a creek in August. "You want to tell me why?" Pike's gaze slipped to the map, then to the weights, then back to me as if I was the only man in the room who might let him pretend this was all an accident. "I mend what breaks," he said. "If a man brings me pipe and asks it cut clean, I cut it. If he pays for straps, I cut those too. And if a man asks you to teach a house to sing," Evelyn asked. "Ain't no law against music." "There is against fraud," Calder said. "Against putting fear on a man's land to move it cheap." He glanced at the refinery men. "You boys got names?" They did, but spoke them soft and wrong, faces set to blank. I let the sheriff do his slow work while I looked at Pike the way you look at a lame horse's leg. Not cruel, not kind, just honest. "Who is W. Hale?" I asked him. "Company man." "Name?" "Hale," he said. And I saw the boy under the beard for a breath, a stubborn boy who'd learned to duck at the last second and felt mighty about it. Evelyn stepped to the map and traced the red line with one clean finger, stopping where it crossed the faint square of my house. "There," she said. "Why the house?" "Because folk already think it's wrong," Pike said. "Easier to push a leaning wall." "Who started the lean?" I asked. He didn't answer, which is an answer. Calder took the refinery names down like he was writing the dates on thunderheads. "Here's what's next," he said. "You'll walk back to town with me. You'll lay down what you know with a pen. If you run, I will find you by the smell of hot iron, and I will not be in a Sunday mood." Pike's shoulders slumped a measure. "I didn't mean harm," he said, like a man standing by a barn that fell after he sold the rotten beam. "I meant money." "That's where harm starts," Evelyn said, and somehow she made it a sentence with mercy in it. "Walk." We headed back. At Haint Ridge's foot, Ranger peeled off the road and put nose to wind. He angled toward my place, then stopped where the orchard used to be and pawed twice. I swung down. The earth was soft as cake. Under an inch of dust lay a coil of hose, freshly cut, and a hammer with pitch on the head. The handle bore a burned mark. Something. I wiped with my thumb and the rest showed. Hart & Sons millwork. An old stamp I'd seen at the bank in a display of history Evelyn had arranged to please a board that treated her like a guest. She knelt. "It's not mine," she said, anger so clean it sounded like grief. "The stamp is from old stock. Hart & Sons closed when my father died. Whoever used the hammer wanted a story that pointed at my door. Then it points wrong," I said, letting the words stand up around her like a fence. "But it points somewhere." Ranger ranged along the orchard wall and stopped at the corner stone. Ears pricked at the ivy there. I pulled Green away and found a slot cut into the stone's back face. Inside, a spool of twine nested like a mouse, and the free end ran into the ground toward the house. I pictured the whole cunning thing. Win the wait at the hotel, pipe the breath to the ridge, guide the note with chords in my walls. The house singing on schedule while the man in charge sat 4 miles away drinking coffee and counting his future. "Let's take the spool," Calder said, "and leave the twine where it lies. And let's all act tonight like we know less than we do. Folks that set traps will step in their own if you let them show off." We agreed to that. Patience with a bit of teeth. Back at the house, the light went soft as biscuit. Lila Finch stood by my porch post like she'd grown there, dressed black now, the plum put away for business. "You didn't come by," she said. "Busy," I said. "So am I," she said, voice rasped by a long night. "Word in town is the sheriff's asking whether a house can lie. I could save him time. A house says whatever the last man nailed to it needed heard." Her eyes moved over the yard and stopped on the disturbed earth near the orchard. "Find a thing?" "Found work," I said. She smiled in that way that admits defeat but invoices for the time anyway. "Pike's a poor liar," she said softly. "He thinks sweat makes a story credible, but the men who paid him are neat. They like velvet. They like other people to clean their boots by standing in the right place." She met my eyes, perfume gone from her voice. "Watch the meetings, Bill, the church socials, the speeches about fixing roads for widows who don't ask." Evelyn stepped onto the porch. White blouse, dark skirt, posture like a flag that never learned to sag. Lila's smile thinned. Lila nodded once, gracious as a queen accepting rain, and left us to our quiet war. We ate on the porch. Bread, cold beans, hard cheese. Poor food made polite by company. Ranger settled with his chin across the seam, eyes on the road, ears drinking dusk. The first stars came cautious. The house did not sing. I told Evelyn about the orchard slot and the Hart & Sons hammer. She put her hand over the old brand like she could comfort the handle for the lie it had been forced to tell. "My father used to say," she murmured, "that names were promises men try to keep until they get expensive." "What's your promise now?" I asked. "That this house gets its voice back," she said, "and that whoever tried to give it a false one learns to speak under oath." The crickets started, then stuttered off like a song forgot. Ranger stood and gave one warning breath. Footsteps on the road, a lantern bobbing. W. Hale himself stepped into the yard, mid-40s, suit that used to be finer, smile that had learned to live on air. He tipped his hat to Evelyn, then to me, then to the threshold where Ranger waited like a judge. "Neighbors," Hale said, "I hear there's been noise." "Not tonight," I said. "Pity," he said, eyes sliding over the corners, measuring. "I'm fond of music." "Mister," "Hale," Evelyn said. "Your company's name appears in filings about community improvements. You'll describe them downtown in the morning." "Delighted," he said, syllables rolled in butter. "But why wait? Improvements are a kind of love poem to the place we share." He set his lantern on the step, exactly on the seam Ranger guarded. The dog didn't move. Hale smiled at him the way a man smiles at a mirror that won't lie. "Fine animal," he said. "Smart. Careful." He lifted the lantern again, as if testing how much the threshold would let him borrow. "That's as far as you go," I said. He looked up and took the measure of the thing he'd wanted for weeks. A man where an empty had been. His eyes cooled like iron dunked in water. "There's a road coming," he said mildly. "You can stand in front of it if the mood takes you. I don't advise it." "I don't stand in front of roads," I said. "I stand in front of men." He laughed without sound. "Tomorrow then," he said. He nodded to Evelyn with a politeness that had edges, then walked into his own shadow until it took him, lantern and all. Evelyn said he wanted to look at the seam. He wanted Ranger to blink, I said. "Ranger doesn't blink." She scratched the dog where the skull meets stubborn. Ranger closed his eyes once, like a king permitting affection because justice had been seen to. The night breathed out. The boards did not creak. The cords below kept their peace like soldiers sleeping at last. And I, a man who had moved into a boarded house no one would buy, felt for the first time like the house had started to consider me worth speaking plain to, once the lies were done singing themselves dry. I woke to wind licking the ridge like a match hunting sulfur. The house held quiet, cords asleep, boards content to be boards. Evelyn arrived with the light dressed clean in work. Dark skirt, white blouse. Hair pinned like she owed nothing to chance. "Receipts," she said. "If the truth can't carry a tune, it can at least carry a date." We spread the papers across a crate. The shapes of other men's intentions stared up at us in careful ink. A ledger from the freight house showing drums of pitch ordered to a dead name. Another line for bellows leather charged to a church committee that had never seen a stitch of it. And a crisp invoice from W. Hale and Company that pretended to be for fence posts. Sheriff Calder came through the cottonwoods while we read. "You plan to serve him scripture or supper first?" he asked. "Paper," Evelyn said. "Then a plan." My plan was quiet enough to keep from scaring itself away. I told it soft. "We're going to make the house sing before he wants it to. We'll be standing inside when it does." Calder's brow lifted. "Risky." "True," I said, "but fear's a better witness when it gets surprised." We left the porch and took the old orchard path to the stone, with the twine slot cut in back. The twine still ran out toward the house like a spider web that believed in law. I tied a tiny bell from my saddlebag to the loose line by the stone. If someone pulled that twine from the hotel end, the bell would speak. "Now we wait," I said. "And while we wait, we look higher." Higher meant the attic. The ladder stairs were narrow enough to make regret useful. I went first with a lantern and a strip of cloth tied over my mouth, because I'd learned what old dust can do to a man's will. The attic was a long wedge of air and splinters. At the far gable, a vent sat behind a cross-hatched grid nailed fresh. A pipe no wider than 2 fingers ran through a hole in the vent frame, inward, then downward out of sight into a wall. "New solder," I said, still bright. Behind me, the opening to the stair darkened and then lit again. Evelyn had climbed halfway, stopped at the threshold, and held her lantern up so I could borrow her light without sharing her lungs with the attic's past. "There's handwriting on the inside of the vent," she said, squinting. "2 initials and a date." I leaned close and read where she pointed. "E.H., it said, in a girl's careful hand. "You?" I asked. She breathed out a thin smile. "Ellis Hart, my mother. She used to climb where she shouldn't and leave her name where weather couldn't erase it. They stuck their pipe right through her initials. Then we'll return the favor," I said. I pulled the pipe free with a twist, felt it fight, then surrender like a stubborn song going off key. The air changed. The house took a deeper breath, then relaxed. Ranger below patted in a tight circle and settled again. We came down. Calder stood with his thumbs on his belt. "He's not going to use the hotel rig now that he knows you've got eyes," he said. "He'll improvise," I answered. Pride makes a man try to play louder when someone turns down the tune. The little bell by the orchard stayed silent. Lila Finch came up the road in a black jacket and set both hands on the gate. "Sheriff," she said. "Bill, Miss Hart." She passed a folded sheet of paper. "I brought a thing I shouldn't keep," she said. "You can pay me back by not preaching." Evelyn took the paper cautiously and read. The saloon lark's letterhead stared pleasant as a lie. Below it, an order for 20 jars of lamp oil and 4 yards of hose for demonstration purposes was charged to the church social committee. Evelyn's mouth flattened. "He uses church pages to wrap his fire," she said. "Men like that like hymns," Lila said. "They hum while their boys count money." "Are we enemies today, Miss Hart?" "We want the same thing," Evelyn answered. "Only one of us wants it clean." "Fair," Lila said. "You'll need more than paper. You'll need a scene." "Then come watch," I said. The bell at the orchard gave the faintest chime. Ranger stood. We went at once. Me, Calder, Evelyn with her skirts caught in a clean fist, Lila stepping over puddles. The twine trembled gentle as a flinch. The bell spoke again. Ting. Calder pointed. "Hotel line," he said. "Someone's testing whether we're listening." "Let him test," I said. "I've got ears." I left the line and cut uphill to the old windbreak, where the ridge gathers itself to throw. Through a stand of cedar I saw a man in a rain cape lean into a hand crank set on a tripod. Each turn drew breath down a hose that ran to a pipe mouth in the rocks. The pipe mouth faced my house like it had opinions. "Ranger," I said, voice low. He moved with me. The cranker never turned his head. He was humming a song I didn't know the words to, just the beat, the same beat the house had learned to fake. I stepped close enough to touch his shoulder and said, "You've missed a note." He spun and threw his own surprise to the ground. The handle whirled and clacked. The hose bucked like a live rope, and the pipe mouth coughed a hard, wet groan that rolled across the meadow and smacked the house's face. Evelyn, far below, turned to look. The cranker stumbled. Ranger flowed between his legs and stood quiet. I took the man's wrist and turned the hand to see the ring. Nickel, flat, with WH bitten into it by an impatient tool. "What's your name?" I asked. "Walt," he said, swallowed rain. "Walter Hale." "Kin?" "Cousin," he said and tried on a grin. "Company man." Calder came up and took Walt by the elbow. "Walk," he said. Walt walked because Ranger and my hand agreed he would. We turned back down the hill. The rain thickened and a runnel formed along the porch eave, carrying grit and old spider husks. Ranger left the sill long enough to nose at the downspout where it met the ground. He pawed twice, then bit at something that wouldn't quite come. I knelt and worked with him. Out slid a wad of oiled paper, folded into itself like it had tried to be its own envelope. I eased it open with 2 fingers and a curse kept behind my teeth. The ink had bled but hadn't drowned. The oil had done its mean mercy. A supplier's stamp showed through. Pitch and resin Calder Station sold to a WH, with delivery marked not to the hotel proper but to boarded property, Haint Ridge, East Porch Side. Evelyn leaned in, water shining on her lashes. "He delivered to your house," she said, her voice low as a bare wire. "He brought the story here so it wouldn't have to travel." Calder turned the page with a knuckle. A second slip clung behind it. A receipt for a lever clamp and 2 yards of leather hose, signed by a hand that had learned to draw straight lines even when drunk. The date was yesterday. Lila made a small sound that wasn't pity and wasn't joy. "Wet receipts," she said. "Honest by accident." I held the paper up to the gray light. The edges shook in the rain breeze, and for a breath I saw the house the way Hale must see it. Not home, not history, just a junction box where fear could be wired and left humming. Ranger licked the oil from his whiskers and sat, satisfied that he had fetched something heavier than any bone. "That'll read fine in a courtroom," Calder said. "It reads finer on a porch." Evelyn folded the slip between clean handkerchief squares and tucked it inside her satchel as if tucking a child into a dry bed. "Now," she said, standing with her shoulders set, "if he comes carrying paper, we'll bring ours too." When I came out, the rain worked itself into business. Walt flinched at thunder like he owed it money. Hale stepped from the road as if the storm had polished him. "Neighbors," he said, "I brought documents." Evelyn's chin lifted. So did I. She lifted her satchel and did not offer it. "You're letting it sing," he said. "Brave." "Boring," I said. "Noise without a heart is just a loud broom." "Petition," he said, "for improvement and access. Signatures from good people. You can add yours or not, but I'd hate for you to be on the wrong side of ease." "Show me the donors," Evelyn said. "Privacy," he said. "Decency." Calder reached out and turned the envelope with 2 fingers like a man who has handled snakes and knows the right distance. The donors slid into the light. Refinery men, a judge's nephew, the preacher's wife's cousin, and a handful of blank lines filled by the same careful hand. The H that looked like a snake trying to sit up. Evelyn's eyes chilled. "Forgery," she said. "Efficiency," Hale answered. The storm found its rhythm, its own. A drum on distance, a hiss in the cottonwoods, the rattle of drops under the eaves. I felt the ridge rise behind us like a witness, and the floor answer under my boots like an oath waiting for a name. "Inside," Calder snapped. He lifted Walt and all but rolled the man through the door. Lila flicked rain off her sleeve and slid in after him. Evelyn waited. I passed. She followed. I set the bar. The first rider hit the porch. The second swung off his horse and tried the window. Ranger placed himself between door and window. The house fell into a new sound, the groan of a floor carrying weight toward the cellar stairs. "Walt," I said. "Who else knows the back way down?" He went pale as a dry bone. "No one," he said. I ran low to the kitchen, lifted the trap, and looked into the cool. A shadow peeled off a beam. The voice came soft. "Don't step on my hand, Bill." "Pike," I said. He froze, then stepped into the lantern light. He held a receipt inside oilcloth. He offered it up. He paid me to change the weight, to speed it, to make the song meaner. "Who is he when he's not a company?" I asked. "Judge's nephew, church cousin, W. Hale when day needs him and Whit Hale when night buys him whiskey." I wanted a cut. I got cut instead. Thunder stood over our roof. Outside, hooves scuffed and men swore. The door held. Evelyn stood by the window. Lila sat on the arm of a chair. Calder, with Walt in hand, said to Pike, "You'll come too." "I know," Pike said. I set my palm to the door and felt the board's answer with a promise. "Not tonight." And in the middle of thunder and bad ideas with horses, I felt something quiet. A house leaning our way. Ranger looked at me. He set one paw a breath farther across the seam and left it there. "Hold," I said to the room, to the sheriff, to the women who could break men without cracking nails, to the house that had been taught to lie and had chosen instead to keep still. Hold. And we did. All right. Morning came pale and sore. The 2 riders were gone, sent packing by Sheriff Calder with a promise in his eyes that they'd be found again when the pen was ready. Pike and Walt sat in my parlor with their wrists tied to chair arms, tight enough to remind. Ranger watched from the seam with that steady old patience God gives to dogs and country judges. Evelyn brewed coffee on the stove. Lila arrived bringing biscuits from the Lark, heat wrapped in a towel that smelled like butter and smoke. "Today's the day," Evelyn said, handing Calder a cup. "We make it sing for an audience. Everyone who signed anything with W. Hale on it," I said, "plus the ones who didn't, and the preacher who blessed the receipts, and the judge's nephew, and the men who like to say the word progress while the bill slides under someone else's door. I can invite better than the church bell," Lila said. "You want a crowd, you start the whisper in the hour before noon and leave a jar of peanuts on the bar. Folks will arrive with opinions they didn't know they had." Evelyn spread our papers on the table. Wet receipts dried between handkerchiefs. The oil order with boarded property printed plain, Pike's confession in a blocky hand that took no pride in letters, and the chits from the bank ledger stitched to names. She separated them into packets. One for the judge, one for the preacher, one for the town clerk, one for Pearlie. "What about the rig?" Calder asked, chin toward the hill where the pipe mouth faced our house like a mouth trained to pout. "We'll move their orchestra to the old hotel," I said. "Let the house rest, let the hotel take its turn as a liar." Pike coughed. "You want me there?" "You're coming regardless," Calder said. Pike looked at his hands. "I'll tell it," he said. "I got tired of breathing coal and decided I'd breathe nickel. Nickel belies itself sooner or later." Walt tried the grin he'd worn last night. It didn't fit better in daylight. "My cousin won't come if you ask," he said. "He'll come if you brag." "Then brag we shall," Lila said. We untied Pike and Walt long enough to walk them to the wagon. The rain had washed the ridge clean but left the ruts deeper. Ranger paced the porch edge, then trotted ahead, nose to ground, leading us past the orchard and down the road toward the hotel. By noon, the ballroom wore our plan. We dragged the crank tripod inside and set it near the stage where a pianola once taught townsfolk to waltz badly. We ran hose to the old ventilation grills and laced cords through the walls along the route the singers had carved. I set the weights on a bench and let them thump like hearts the size of flour sacks. Calder went room to room with a deputy's patience and collected one extra bellows, 2 short lengths of hose, 4 clamps, and a spool of twine fat enough to tie up a steer. Evelyn stood on the stage, daylight and shadow in partnership. "When the cranks begin," she said, nodding at the mechanism, "this place will moan. I'll show the crowd where the breath comes from. Bill will stop it and start it at my signal. Sheriff, you will stand with Pike and Walt by the front so no one believes the sound is a ghost escaping custody." "And me?" Lila asked from a velvet chair. "You'll keep the crowd looking where it ought," Evelyn said. "You know people the way the wind knows wheat." "I'll curtsy when the ghost bows." Lila smiled. We ate lark biscuits and laughed a little, and then Dry Willow arrived shoulder to shoulder with its own story. The judge's nephew came in wearing a tie that wished it were expensive. The preacher's cousin shook hands. Pearlie rolled her basket down the aisle and parked herself like a hen about to explain patience to a dog. Men with hats, women with better hats, 3 ranchers, and a few refinery boys. Whit Hale came last, of course, holding his hat against a breeze that wasn't in the room. "Neighbor," he said, letting the word walk in and hang up its coat. "Whit," I said. Evelyn clapped once. A schoolroom summons so clean even the dust stood up. The room quieted. Ranger sat at the stage steps, tail coiled, ears switching from face to face as if he were counting who shared whose heartbeat. "We are here," Evelyn began, "to retire a legend and replace it with evidence. You will hear a moan. You will feel a tremble. You will see where the breath is made, how it travels, and who paid for the choir. No one need faint. Those who feel the urge may sit. Those who feel the need to leave may do so without comment." "I ain't leaving till the ghost pays for eggs," Pearlie snorted. Laughter tipped the room toward ease. Whit's smile thinned to a string. I nodded to Calder. He nodded to me. I wound the weight and let it drop to slow unwinding. The hose filled its narrow chest. The ballroom found its deepest note, long, low, freighted with church wind and memory. Women stiffened. Men shifted. Ranger stayed put, but his ears tracked the sound through the wall like birds across a wire. "Here," Evelyn said, stepping to the vent. "A pipe." She followed it with her fingers along the molding. "Here, a bend meant to catch the wall and set it singing." She found the closet, opened the crooked panel, showed the bright new solder. "And here," she said, "the pretty part. A weight and a crank. It mimics a man but requires none." "Show," Pearlie called. I stopped the crank. The house exhaled and went quiet. I started it again and the moan returned, a shy beast invited back by habit. People muttered. Whit smiled with too many teeth. "Clever," he said. "A civic demonstration of acoustics. We are fortunate to have so much initiative for our town's future." Evelyn lifted a packet. "And here is the future," she said. reading names, dates, sums, oil, hose, clamps, cords, false signatures, church bills. The room listened to each word. Lila rose and turned slow, catching eyes. "Paper is patient," Whit said, "and it's been known to lie." Pike stepped up then, hands out, palms visible. "I welded the joints," he said. "I cut the hose. I put the bellows in place. I made it sing." He swallowed. "I took money from W. Hale and Company. That's him there. Whit Hale when he signs. Walt when he's buying whiskey on credit." Whit's smile collapsed into something surgical. "Defamation from a tradesman," he said. "We will take this up in court with the same vigor we have brought to our roads." Ranger lifted his head and huffed once. I watched his eyes track high. He wasn't watching Whit. He was watching the upper grill over the stage, where a second hose had been painted to look like shadow. I thumbed the latch behind the curtain, the panel side open. Inside sat a pocket crank with a narrow hose, hidden to start the panic if our main rig failed to persuade. I held it up. Calder set it on the judge's nephew's lap. "Hold that," he said. "Think about whose ink you borrowed." "You're making theater," Whit said. Evelyn finished the recitation. She looked at every face in the room in turn and nodded. "We can keep being a town," she said, "or we can become a road." "Amen," the preacher's cousin said before remembering he'd been instructed not to say amen in public this week. The crowd laughed, then grew serious. "Progress will come whether you like it or not," Whit said. "Progress is when we go somewhere together," Evelyn answered. Calder collected the pocket crank and the main crank. I stopped the rig. The ballroom let go a final ghost of sound that was more memory than moan. Before noon, I walked the hotel's side hall with Ranger and found a second twine buried under a skim of plastered dust, routed to a tiny reed set into the crown molding above the cloakroom. Whoever installed it had painted the reed to match shadow, then smeared soot with 2 fingers to dull the shine. Ranger sneezed disdainful. I pried the reed loose and held it to the light, a whistle made from clock spring and tin, cut to call nerves, not ears. I slipped it into my pocket and touched the pocket as if a truth could feel the thanks it had earned. Evelyn joined us there and rested one hand on the molding, palm open. "They built a whole choir," she said. "How many songs does a lie need?" "As many as it takes to be believed by tired people," I said. "So we tire it out instead." She looked at me sidelong, a smile threading through resolve. Lila appeared in the doorway then, hat pinned against the weather. "Your crowd is guaranteed," she said. "I have told them there will be a show, a confession, a petition torn, and possibly pie." "Possibly?" I asked. "I have standards," she said. "If the truth behaves, the pie will too." Near sundown, word came up the hill. A crate stenciled charity had been set on the church steps, nailed with ribbon and stacked with folded blankets. I saddled Shiner, whistled Ranger, and met Evelyn at the fork where the road pretends to make 2 choices and only makes one. At the church, the crate smelled like pitch. Evelyn cut the ribbon. Inside lay blankets on top and under them a neat stack of broadsides. Community relief, brought to you by W. Hale and Company. Each bore the words, "Progress heals." I lifted one blanket. The bottom layer of the crate was a false floor. Beneath sat a tin of lamp oil with its cork, a wick threaded so a single match could turn charity into a little bonfire of proof. "He'd burn his own gifts," Evelyn said, "then point at the smoke and say, 'See what neglect does.'" Calder arrived with Lila 2 steps behind him. "We're taking this to the square," Lila said. "Folks need to see gifts with fuses." She lifted the broadsides like a magician reveals the card you already knew. "We'll tack one to the post and make the words eat themselves." We rolled the crate into the light where Whit's kind prefers shade. Calder knocked out the false floor, set the oil aside. Evelyn stacked the broadsides and set one atop. "Progress heals when it pays the doctor," she said to the small circle gathering. "This is a patient we decline to bleed." Ranger lay at the edge of the square watching the mouths of alleys. Twice he flicked an ear. Twice I followed his gaze. On the second flick I saw Whit at the far corner, hat brim low. He met my eyes and tipped his hat a fraction. "Tomorrow," he mouthed. "Tomorrow, we audit," Evelyn said. Lila passed tin cups of the promised coffee and told the town a story without names, of pipes that sing and strings that tug and wheels that spin in the dark. You know your houses, you know your nights. Believe those before you believe a stranger with a plan. Back home, the porch boards carried the day's weight and gave it back as quiet. I set the charity broadside on the crate we used for a table and wrote across it, "No sale." Evelyn tucked another copy into her satchel. Lila left a cup on the rail for the next rider. Ranger settled, eyes on the seam. I watched the ridge darken until it was outline and promise. The house breathed, timber slow and honest. Dawn came clean as a washed plate. The charity broadside I'd marked, "No sale," lay on the porch crate like a promise kept. Ranger stretched, took the air, and set his chin along the seam the way a man rests his palm on a Bible. Not crossing, but near enough for truth to hear his breath. Evelyn rode up with her hat low and a satchel fat with daylight. Lila walked beside her horse in a black coat that made the morning look paler, eyes lined like she was off to read trouble its rights. They looked like opposite ends of a prayer. Evelyn neat as a ledger, Lila lit from within. Sheriff Calder joined them from the cottonwoods. He tipped his hat to Ranger like a man greets a judge. "Whit will go quiet for a day," Evelyn said. "He'll try the county." She set the satchel on the crate. "He's filed for a safety inspection. If a place is condemned, Progress has courtesy to move in whistling." "Who signed?" I asked. "A deputy clerk with no business signing," she said, "and a note from the judge's nephew with his handwriting straight for once." Lila smiled without humor. "Inspection means men at midnight with oil in their pockets. Then we'll stand ready," Calder said. "But first we make noon loud." We went to town with our papers wrapped in rope like work, not war. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old verdicts. The clerk at the counter wore a bow tie that thought too highly of itself. Evelyn set down the petition Whit had waved and our stack of receipts. She pulled one more thing from her satchel, an affidavit from the freight yard man who hated cheats more than he loved wages. He'd listed dates, weights, signatures. He'd signed his own name in letters big enough to survive wind and gossip. "The county will hear this today," Evelyn said, gentle as bone, and the clerk found a pen he hadn't meant to find. Out on the square, Lila started her noon whisper and made it a song. She poured coffee dark as a rebuke and told folks there'd be a show by sundown, a safety inspection where the safest thing would be the truth. Word galloped. Men leaned in. Women drew near. The refinery boys rang their hats in their hands and tried to look like citizens instead of payroll. Back home, I looked to the ridge and felt it looking back. The hotel crouched like a lie that had learned to nap with one eye open. The orchard wall hid our bell. Ranger nosed it, kind enough to let it keep its silence until the day wanted it. We ate bread and beans in the doorway. The house took its breath slow. When the light rolled toward evening, I oiled the hinges, checked the cellar cord I'd tied, and set a lantern where its light would paint any intruder true. Dusk brought witnesses. Pearlie set up a crate like a pew and a basket like a pulpit. If testimony needed eggs, she was ready. Pike came, hat in hand, face sober the way a man's face gets after he tries to hire his luck and finds it won't work Sundays. Walt followed with his nerves showing. Calder set them both on the porch where the world could see them not sneaking. Evelyn pulled on thin gloves and read the inspection order out loud to the air, then folded it into a pocket as if it were a moth she didn't intend to let fly. Lila stood by the gate with her midnight hat. The brim caught a little of the dying sun and turned it into a thin fire across her mouth. Folks gathered at fence and road. They kept quiet, but their eyes worked. We didn't wait long. 2 men with new coats that hadn't learned the county dust came up the road with tool bags. One carried a tin of oil the way a deacon carries bread. The other had the kind of mustache that hopes to be a policy someday. Behind them walked Whit Hale, not touching them, letting their shadow do his work. He smiled at Evelyn like a letter waiting. "Evening," he said. "Inspection." Calder's badge caught the last of the light and gave it back. "You brought the wrong night for a lie," he said, mild as milk. "Show your papers." They showed papers. Evelyn read them and hummed once. The sound a woman makes when she finds a column of numbers and sees where the hand shook. "Your signature's borrowed," she said to the mustache. "And this seal is from last year. The county changed marks in spring." "Clerical error," Whit said, sweet as a splinter. "Let's be practical." "Practical is good," I said. "Practical is why that oil tin won't touch my floor." I pointed to the tin man's hand. He set it down on the porch as if it had asked please. Ranger stood, placed his paws to the seam and looked past us to the orchard wall. His ears went to points. His tail stilled. The little bell answered him with one kiss of sound. Someone at the hotel line thought they could tune the night. I shook my head. "We don't sing for them anymore," I told the air. The mustache man tried the door. It opened easy. I'd left it that way on purpose. He stepped to the threshold and froze like a rabbit sees a hawk sees a rabbit. Ranger's eyes were not cruel. They were exact. The man took a step back on his own. "We'll examine the cellar," Whit said. "We have reason to believe noxious vapors." "You don't like noxious vapors?" I asked. "Stop shipping them." Laughter rippled. Lila collected it with a turn of her wrist and handed it to Evelyn, who didn't smile so much as decide to later. Calder said, "Here's how it'll go. 2 of my men in first, the inspector with them. No one carries a flame until I say. Miss Hart witnesses. Mr. Maddox holds his temper. Miss Finch keeps the crowd on the cool side of lively." He looked around. "Anyone not mentioned can hold a fence post and think about supper." They went in. Ranger came with me to the line and no farther. He watched the cellar door like it had opinions he respected. The house kept still. We all did. A long minute went by the way a snake goes by. Alive, quiet, and judged too soon when you don't know the kind. Then 3 things happened near enough together to make a man believe the world is a gearing someone built on purpose. First, the hotel bell gave a quick talk. Ting, ting, ting. Second, a whiff of kerosene came not from the men inside but from the gap under the back porch. Third, Whit took 2 steps left like he meant to be in nobody's way and put his heel on the coil of a hose I hadn't seen laid in grass, thin as a vein. It ran from the back porch gap to the side of the house, ending in a little brass mouth set level with the baseboard. "Don't move," I said, and folks obeyed because a voice only goes sharp like that when it's paid up. I reached for the hose, felt the brass mouth wet with oil, and turned it toward the yard. Calder came out of the door at that same breath, eyes already on the ground. "Back," he said, and people gave us room like the old sea. The mustache man appeared behind him, paler, trying to hide a box of matches inside his hat. Pike reached over, took the hat, and set it crown down on the porch so the matches looked lonely. Whit smiled and tried to look troubled. "If there's danger," he began. "There is," Evelyn said, "and it's wearing a tie." She took the oil tin from the porch and set it in the road where it might learn humility. A voice in the dark under the porch said, "Don't shoot." It was the judge's nephew, of course, because the story will use the actor who brings the right face. He crawled out, skirted oil with careful knees, and let Calder put iron on his wrists. His hair had the look of a man who has been introduced to truth by boards and dirt. "What were you going to burn?" Lila asked, tone polite as a church spoon. "The truth," he said before he could stop himself. His face folded when he realized he'd said it. Pearlie hollered, "Hush," without moving her lips, and the crowd enjoyed themselves by not clapping. We went through the cellar with the inspector, kind now that he had nothing to be but honest. He smelled each wall like a doctor. He noted the boards I'd fixed. He traced the cords and found them cut and harmless. He wrote on his pad and tore a sheet and handed it to Evelyn, because a man who wants to do right will aim his paper at the right woman. "No hazard," he said, "except men." Outside, night staked its claim. The hotel bell stopped, maybe because the man on the crank had remembered he owed somebody money someplace else. Whit stood under the cottonwood and measured a future that refused to sum. He tried twice to meet my eyes and settled for watching Ranger like a man studies a gate that won't swing. "Tomorrow," he said, resigned and still sure. "Courthouse." "We like courthouses," Evelyn said. "They have chairs." He tipped his hat to her and to Lila, who didn't return it. Then he walked away with the inspector men and their borrowed tools, which looked heavier now that they were only themselves. The crowd thinned, leaving footprints that told the ground we'd been brave and nosy and maybe good. Pearlie boxed her eggs and told Pike she'd accept an apology in the form of 3 hinges money couldn't buy. Walt shook my hand and tried to stand taller than his shame. Calder took his prisoners and his paperwork and left his promise behind like a lantern, bright enough to keep us honest, dim enough to let us sleep. Evelyn and I stayed a while on the porch. Lila lit one match on the step and burned the forged seal off the fake order, then pinched the coal with her fingers because some women do their own punctuation. "He'll use pity next," she said. "He'll bring widows with him. He'll weep for roads. Then we'll bring deeds," Evelyn said. "And Rangers." She looked at the dog and smiled a fraction softer than the night. Ranger stood, weighed the seam, and made his choice for the evening. One paw into the parlor, the other still out in honest air. He leaned there like a signpost with reasons. I rubbed the notch between his ears where stubborn grows. "Nearly there," I told him. He closed his eyes, one slow blink in a language old as ash water. Sleep took the valley in pieces. The goat wandered by, read the room, and ghosted off. The house didn't sing. The chords didn't try to be more than rope. I rolled my hat over my eyes and drowsed until a coyote told a joke to the moon and got the laugh he wanted. Then I woke full and went to the door, because some mornings begin before the clock. We rode out at gray to meet the courthouse noon, papers in a wrap, heart steadier than yesterday and less certain than tomorrow. The ridge moved with us like a jury nodding slow. At the square, folks were already standing in lines that weren't lines yet, humming the tune of a day that might behave. Witt's men leaned together, whispering policy. Our people didn't whisper so much as breathe at the same pace. The judge's nephew avoided windows. The preacher's cousin held his hymn book upside down to keep his courage from drying out. Inside, the hall was busy with benches and opinions. Witt's lawyer asked for a delay. The clerk refused. Pike, Walt, and the judge's nephew stood ready. The county attorney studied our papers and nodded. The judge, strict and not kin, took the bench at noon and told us to keep our voices in our mouths. When the clock struck, he nodded, and the day began to explain itself. We sat straighter. I felt the ridge behind my ribs, the house steady as a hand on a plow. Ranger set his chin on my boot and watched the door. Whatever came next had to walk past his eyes. I tipped my hat brim a notch and saved my words, the way a man saves water for the steep part of the trail. Evelyn's hand found the folder and stilled. Sure. The courthouse smelled like floor wax and worry. Folks filled the benches until the walls learned to listen. I sat with my hat on my knee and Ranger at my boot, the German shepherd steady as a gate that's been hung true. Evelyn smoothed a page with the back of her fingers and wore that clean look of hers. The look numbers get when they've been scrubbed of excuses. Lila was darker thunder beside her, black coat, plum ribbon, a mouth that could bless or break a rumor with equal grace. The judge took the bench like a man who remembered the first time he'd been told right from wrong and never quite got over it. Sheriff Calder stood along the rail and didn't bother pretending he was anywhere else in this world he'd rather be. Whit Hale waited 2 rows back with a lawyer whose haircut believed in itself. The county attorney called Evelyn first. She stood with her palms easy and laid out the story like fence rails, straight, spaced, meant to hold. Receipts, ledgers, the oil order addressed to boarded property Haint Ridge, the freight man's affidavit. She did not sweeten a thing. When Whit's lawyer tried to raise dust, she simply looked at him the way a ledger looks at a man who writes numbers he can't pay. The dust settled by itself. Pike came next, hat tight in his hands, voice tight in his throat. He told how the pipes were cut, the bellows strapped, the crank wound, how the house had been taught to sing on command for men who didn't want to be anywhere near the song when it started. He said I did it more than once and I wish I hadn't at the end, which is a small kind of penance that towns remember. Then Walt, cousin Walter Hale, told the truth with the carefulness of a man stepping stones across spring flood. He showed the ring with W.H. bitten into it. He named Whit for Whit and for W. Hale and Company when the suit needed somewhere to hide. The inspector read his notes. No hazard found except men. A sentence like that sits well in a room that farms honesty for a living. Pearlie said amen under her breath and pretended she was coughing. Whit's lawyer did his work. He called me the silent cowboy, with a turn meant to pull a laugh and only found a cough. He asked whether I profited from attention. I said the only thing I sell is horseshoes, and not to him. He asked if my dog's refusal to cross a threshold wasn't proof of unclean spirits. The room smiled. The judge did not. "Counsel," the judge said, "dogs don't lie on purpose." "Some people don't either," I added soft. The judge let the room enjoy that for one breath. When they called Lila, she set her hands on the rail and looked every inch the Queen of Midnight. She did not confess. She observed. She told how fear is bought in small barrels and poured out in large crowds, how men with tidy gloves hire the untidy to do the touching, how a saloon's letterhead can hide either a kindness or a knife but never both. "We chose kindness," she said, "and they brought knives." Whit's lawyer asked if she was a woman of ill repute. She smiled like an organ note sliding toward mercy and said, "Only to men who bill lies as improvements." Ranger didn't testify, not with words, but when the pocket crank came out in an evidence sack, he made a small, sharp sound in his throat, as if bones remembered where they were buried. The judge, who would never admit to reading dog, seemed to weigh something that wasn't written on any page. By mid-afternoon, the county attorney hauled onto the table a burlap bag tagged Friends of Progress. Inside lived subscription lists, names and sums, the kind good men sign at socials without studying the footnotes. The attorney read 3 names slow, then 3 quicker, and then a string of initials that had all been penned with the same tidy hand. "The same hand signed the fake inspection order," he said, showing the bold H that tried to look like a ladder. The room looked at Whit the way pasture looks at a weather vane that suddenly points where nobody wants to go. The court enjoins the so-called W. Hale and Company from any activity related to the Haint Ridge property or the old hotel. The judge looked over his glasses at Whit. "Sir, you will leave that house alone. You will leave that town alone. You will appear for indictment when called." He turned to the sheriff. "Mr. Calder, take the nephew into custody now for attempted arson and forgery. Set Pike and Walter Hale to recognizance. They will return as summoned." The gavel fell. Evelyn let out a breath you could have used to turn chaff. Lila's teeth flashed the way summer lightning reassures a man the storm has passed him this time. Whit rose with a smile that had learned how to hold its shape while other things fell. He murmured to his lawyer, to the ceiling, to the future he thought owed him. He did not look at me until he had to pass. Then he tipped his hat without meaning it and said, so quiet the angels probably shook their heads, "It ain't over. It will be," I said. "Some endings take a minute." We walked out with our papers stacked like biscuits and our spines stacked like fence posts. Ranger paced us. Dry Willow met us with low talk and high glances. Pearlie sold 24 eggs to a juror who'd come in hungry and leave with breakfast for his sister. The refinery boys let their hats ride a little lower and their eyes ride a little higher. Calder signed 2 forms with the patience of a man who knows where paperwork goes to die and how to keep it alive long enough to do good. At the Lark that night, coffee stood in for whiskey. We rested and spoke little. I walked home under stars bright enough to remind a man he wasn't the first to wonder and wouldn't be the last. The ridge loomed clean. The orchard was a black lace against a silver field. On the porch, the charity broadside with no sail on it lay flat as if even paper understood when to be steady. I set a lantern inside the door and left it there like a heart. Ranger lay longwise with his chest over the seam and slept the kind of sleep that keeps watch by itself. Just before dawn, a horse came slow on the road. Men who mean harm ride different. This one was taking inventory of its regrets. Whit sat it. No lawyer now. No cousin. He stopped at the gate and rested his hands on the horn and spoke without the sugar he sold to crowds. You could sell, he said. I could. You could be paid a number that cuts you free clear to New Mexico. Leave this box of splinters to men who can use it. I shook my head. You don't know houses. You don't know roads. I know some roads, I said, and the men who lay them by stepping on what they can't own. You think I'm the end. I'm a rung. The men who sent me will still want straight lines through crooked towns. They'll come with papers I don't need to sign anymore. I reckon they will, I said, but they won't be singing under my floors. Whit looked past me through the doorway at the small glow of the lamp, the plain, honest chair, the scoured boards, the shape of a room preparing to be lived in without lies. He ever cross? He asked, meaning Ranger. When the house stops pretending, I said. He nodded once like a man conceding a point in a game he still intends to win in overtime. He turned his horse, then back. One last lesson. They tried fear and failed. Next comes pity, then hunger, then law in a cleaner suit. Keep your papers dry, keep your people close. He swallowed a thing he'd meant to spit. I've done worse work for better men. I've done better work for worse. He flicked the rein and rode. I watched him go and wished him a future that cost him exactly as much as it had cost us. Sun found the lip of the world and poured itself over the porch rail. I took the crank and the weights and the hose and carried them to the hotel. I set them in the center of the ballroom and lit them, each one in turn, till they were only quiet junk. A few townsfolk came and stood in the doorway and watched the little unfuneral. Pearlie sniffed and said she'd never liked those contraptions anyway. They were unmusical. The preacher's cousin said nothing and held the door. Maybe that was his sermon. Lila leaned on the rail and let the smoke find other places to be. We spent the day peeling boards. Not a rush. Careful work makes houses remember why they stand. Men with broad backs and quiet hands. Women bright as flags. Evelyn in white and dark. Lila in black. Contrast making the afternoon prettier than its chores. I pulled nails that had learned to love their holes. We sent the worst boards to the woodpile, the best to the shed for other lives. Ranger supervised with the grave attentiveness of a foreman who takes his pay in shadows and crumbs. By sundown, the parlor had 3 windows that could see again. The floorboards shone where scrub met patience. I set the piano lid back in its hinges, and when it spoke its small wooden hello, Evelyn looked away quick like the sound had found something inside she didn't loan easily to rooms. Lila, not looking away from anything, pressed one key, soft, and the note stayed in the room like a bird that wasn't afraid of us anymore. Calder came at dusk carrying his kind of quiet. He said the court would sit again in a week and the papers would turn from complaints to charges. He said the county had posted guards at the hotel and the ridge, and that anyone touching a pipe without permission would be standing in front of him with their hat in their hands and their excuses in their mouth. We're done with songs unless they're chosen, he said, and looked a little surprised to hear himself say it. Night lay down. Folks drifted off with that slow good tired that knows when it has done enough. Lila kissed the porch post, a joke to make it a friend, and left a promise of coffee on the rail. Evelyn stood just inside the door and gathered hairpins into her palm like she was counting victories. Bill, she said. Evelyn. She hesitated, which is rare for her. Do you want? She stopped, found a better sentence. Do you need anything? Nothing I can't earn, I said. But if you want to bring one of those bank pens that writes the truth stubborn, I'd keep it on the mantel a while. Might change the feel of the room. Her smile held. She set one pen there, snug, and it looked like a slim little oath. I'll come by in the morning, she said, to tally the rescued planks. I'll have numbers by then, I said, and Ranger thumped agreement. She turned to go, then turned back and did the smallest thing. A touch to the doorframe, just 2 fingers, as if to tell the house it was under new management. Then she went into the night that keeps books on us all. I doused the lamp and stood with Ranger at the seam, The two of us taking the house's temperature. It felt right. Not cured. Houses don't get cured or sick. They get tended or neglected, but right in the way a calf finds its legs, shaky and true at once. "Come on then," I said to him, not a command, not a dare, just a sentence we could both walk on. He stepped. One paw, then the other crossed the threshold like a promise kept without ceremony. His nails clicked once on the parlor floor and stopped when he lay down full on the boards, head on his paws, eyes on me, then on the room, then on sleep. I didn't cry because I was raised in places where weather takes the salt men would waste, but my throat went tight enough to hold a man still. I went to the piano and pressed one key, not for ghosts, for wood and air and a roof that had learned how to keep its music. The note hummed the length of my arm and into the bones of the house and settled there. No pipes answered, no chords, nothing but true sound spending itself honest. I pulled the last board off the back window and watched the valley carry our silence toward the hotel like a message. Not angry, not afraid, just finished. A coyote called. The goat answered, late but earnest. Somewhere the sheriff's boot found his porch and said goodnight for him. The ridge breathed. The house breathed back. Men came to buy this place with fear. They left poorer. A quiet cowboy moved into a boarded house no one would buy, and his dog wouldn't cross the threshold until the house told the truth. When it did, he did. That's the story. If there's another, it'll have to ask permission from the piano and the dog and the woman who sets pens on mantles like prayers. I banked the fire and pulled my hat down and let sleep climb me slow. Tomorrow we'd fix the stable and the east eave and the thin place in the hall. Tomorrow the county would count and the judge would weigh and the road would bend or break. But tonight, the boards held, the windows watched, the piano remembered its chords, and Ranger lay where he belonged, inside a house that had chosen its men and refused all others. A week later, the court counted again. The charges came in neat as hymn numbers: fraud, conspiracy to defraud, attempted arson, filing a false instrument, misuse of public trust. The nephew went away easy as a letter dropped in a chute. The refinery boys found themselves rehearsing the difference between payroll and perjury, and several discovered they could pronounce apologize with convincing vowels. Wit stayed free for the moment on bonds put up by men who say temporary, like a prayer. He stood at the edge of the square and looked at the hotel, and then at my house, and then at his own boots like he'd misplaced something and couldn't decide whether to miss it. Engineers came with flags and a roll of paper. Evelyn showed deeds. Calder walked the ridge line and pointed where bedrock sleeps shallow. Lila poured coffee and kept notes. After 3 days, the line on the map bent the way a good road should, around kitchens, graves, swallows, shade. The spur would still find freight. It just wouldn't run through anybody's supper. We held a raising that wasn't a barn, more a restoration the town could put its name to. Pearlie brought pies that set records for truth. The preacher's cousin brought hymn numbers and the willingness not to sing them unless asked. Children stayed home by rule. The work was heavy and the jokes were grown. Women shone, some in white, some in black, all of them beautiful in a way boards understand. Purpose married to grace. Men lifted and set, the rhythm of forgiveness when it agrees to be useful. The house learned our names by the sound of our boots. Upstairs under the eave where the new vent would go honest, I found the initials again, E.H., sharp as the day they were cut. I set my own small marks beside them, but lower, a carpenter's humility, B.M. Not to say I own this, but to say, this held me up. Evelyn came up with a tin of varnish and sealed those letters into a shine that could shrug off years. My mother would have liked you, she said, and I believed her. On a Tuesday night, I met the man who had sent Wit, one of the rungs he'd spoken of. He wanted the right of way, I wanted the right of stay. We stood on the hotel porch. Tell me where this line can run and still leave your shadow alone. I walked him to the creek, showed the old mule track, showed the bend that would cost him timber but return him sleep. He nodded like a man who dislikes compromise but hates waste more. I signed nothing. He signed a promise to send new plans and did. Ranger made a circuit of every room that week, nose low, tail flagging slow, as if he were writing a soft letter to each corner. You may keep your secrets, but they must not be lies. In the attic, he stopped by the vent and put his paw on the frame and looked at me. I touched the wood and said, "EH," and he sneezed once as if to say he'd already read it. He slept in the doorway the first 2 nights by habit. The 3rd night he forgot to remember and chose the hearth. Lila redecorated the lark with a framed broadside that read, "Community relief," with our added stamp beneath, "No sale." Folks laughed and touched the glass for luck. Evelyn brought a black ledger with gilt edges and set it next to the pen on my mantel. "Contracts for repairs," she said, and a list of who is owed favors. Also a page where I wrote what we will not do. It helps to stare at the word no until it's pretty. I thumbed the page and agreed. She added a small vase with wildflowers to the piano, and against my better judgment it did not look foolish. It looked like certainty in color. As for Whit, he came once more in daylight with 2 men behind him. He said he was going to Denver. He said this town would miss him. I said the town would miss its fear. He squinted at the dog, at the pen, at the open windows. He looked almost young for a heartbeat, as if some other boy had been asked to carry an older man's plans and had finally set them down. I'm not saying we won the world. We won a house, a ridge, a way to sleep. That'll do. If you ever need our recipe, it isn't much. A good dog, a clean ledger, a sheriff with a patient spine, pretty women with eyes like verdicts, a town that remembers where its kitchens are, and a piano that only tells the truth. Before sleep took us, the ridge let go a last warm breath, and the house answered once timber to timber like a vow kept.